Hello everyone, my name is Simon, you're watching Simon Talks Music, and before I get into anything else, I want to talk a little bit about 2026 in general for me this year, mainly regarding this YouTube channel. Now, one of my main goals for 2026 was to upload more on this YouTube channel. I've been trying to do that for the past few years, and eventually I've just hit points where I just have not felt like uploading at all, and this year I really wanted to be committed to uploading more than I usually do. And so far, I've been doing that. I've been reviewing a lot more albums than I even expected that I would by this time in the year. And honestly, I'm proud of myself for it. I think, the quality of reviews has sometimes been sacrificed a little bit, but I don't really mind. I do typically go by a quantity over quality rule in general for my reviews. There are exceptions to that where I will talk about an album in more detail when I really feel like it. And there have been specific episodes where I've talked more in detail about the albums. But for the most part, I just try and review as many albums as I can. And at the end of the day, it's all just my personal opinions on the albums. So, I'm not trying to pretend to be some super amazing music critic who knows exactly what I'm talking about. Like, there's always going to be details that I miss. And I think that's okay. I'm just telling you my experience with the albums. And my opinions can change on albums too. I feel like it doesn't happen as much now as it used to, but still, I can re-listen to an album later and recognize that maybe I missed something, and it might change my opinion on it, and that's okay. But I will admit I have kind of hit a point recently over the past few weeks where I've just felt a little bit overwhelmed. I do have a job outside of this, and I'm a college student as well, and it's getting toward final season, and, I've been working more hours recently than I have the past couple of weeks. At least I'm pretty sure I have. I haven't really added it up. But my point being, I have a life outside of this. And for that reason, I just want to say the reviews, for at least for this month, are probably going to slow down a bit. And they might not be as in-depth as I was hoping either. I feel like a lot of the time I've either prioritized getting more reviews out, or in certain weeks I've prioritized the quality of reviews, and for the next, probably at least the next month or so, both of those things are going to go down a little bit. The reviews are going to be quite brief, and there's also going to be less of them. Now, for this video, these albums over the past week or so, I have kind of dedicated a bunch of time to listening to them more, and some of them I went more in-depth on. Some of them I kept very brief as well because of time reasons. Again, I've got like school projects and stuff like that. And I don't want to just spend all my time of my day just working on this YouTube channel. But after this week, I think I'm going to maybe just step away a little bit. Not entirely. It doesn't mean the uploads are going to stop. I definitely want to keep consistently putting out album reviews. But there's just not going to be as many as there have been for the first couple months of this year. And they also might be even more brief than usual. And again, I'm okay with that. If you don't want to watch them because of that, that's fine too. I'm just doing my thing, and, people will watch it if they want to. But anyway, with all of this being said, and I don't think I've missed anything important, I've got 7 albums to talk about today. Some of these reviews are going to be very, very brief, and some of them are a little bit more in-depth, but they're all mini reviews. I mean, they're not meant to be super full length or anything like that. And as always, it's all just my personal opinions on these albums. If I say something negative, it's not meant to, be like attacking the artists or anything like that. I'm just giving my personal opinions on the albums. Feel free to disagree with me on them. Or you can agree. Let me know in the comments section what you think. This has been a very long intro, so I'm going to get into actually talking about the albums. But, I won't have as much negative to say today as I will in some episodes because, yeah, the interesting thing is, this doesn't happen very often, but the majority of the albums in this video I think are legitimately great. Yeah, there's 7 albums, the majority of them I think are legitimately great. That is quite surprising, and I'm not complaining about that at all. But anyway, let's get the review started with... Alright, so like I said, I don't have all the time in the world to write detailed reviews, and this is the last review I wrote for this video, and I was in a bit of a time crunch to get these all done, so I'm keeping this one really brief. But for those of you who don't know, Spunkshine is an American music producer who's not very well known, but I think he's mostly known by his audience for making ambient music. although he definitely includes other kinds of electronic music as well. And I haven't heard that many of his albums, but I've really liked the ones I have heard, so I was pretty optimistic about this new album. And yeah, this is excellent. It's not that different from what I would have expected from Spunkshine, with the very playful grooves, quirky experimentation, and repetition that leads to what I'd probably call minimalism, which you can see me talking about a few weeks back when I reviewed Eric Hall's Solo 3. But I feel like this new Spunkshine album is exactly what I didn't know I needed in 2026, where the contrast of peaceful tracks like Rotational Melancholia with more gloomy moments like Epistemic Exhaustion just hit a certain mood for me, as someone who's felt a lot of peace and comfort this year as well as a lot of fear. I mean, I think a lot of us have. Although it is worth mentioning that this album is way more comforting than it is uneasy. And the percussion sounds great, the grooves are really strong, and it's another reminder to me that I've got to check out more of Spunkshine's music. Again, not a whole lot to say here, but it's a fairly strong 8 out of 10, and I highly recommend you check it out for yourself. His albums don't really give me a lot to analyze, but they're certainly satisfying. Alright, here we have the 8th studio album from Mitski, a very critically acclaimed singer and songwriter who has been getting a lot of critical acclaim for about a decade now, especially after her 2018 album Be the Cowboy, which I think made a lot of people retrospectively listen to her first few albums. And most of her albums have been very critically acclaimed, including this album's predecessor from 2023, The Land is Inhospitable and So Are We, which also featured her first mainstream hit, My Love, Mine, All Mine, which is a great song, but I was a little underwhelmed by the album. And honestly, I say that even as someone who's not the biggest Mitski fan. My two favorite albums of hers are Puberty 2 and Laurel Hell, both of which contain multiple legitimately great tracks, but I don't really love either album as a whole. The latter made my year-end list in 2022, and I'll admit I was wildly overrating it when I did that. Although I do find it odd that so many critics call it her worst album, because while I don't think it's great, it is still really damn good and honestly close to great. Maybe her best album if you ask me. And then, like I said, her 2023 album just wasn't as good as I hoped it would be. But whatever, it's been 2.5 years since then, and I was still pretty excited for this new album, even though I'm not the biggest Mitski fan. Hopefully it would at least deliver 1 or 2 great songs. That's usually something I can count on with her albums. And yeah, I think in that regard, this delivered. Dead Women has to be one of the most chilling songs she's ever made, with its lyrics about the objectification of women showing the haunting reality that some men simply view women as sexual objects for their own pleasure, with lines such as, "She gave her life so we could fuck her as we please." And the instrumental has the kind of subtle glamour which might even fit for that male fantasy, which I think is intentionally ironic, to try and show a glimpse into that kind of selfish mind. While not an easy listen, it's a terrific song that might be one of her best. And I also love Cats for its desperate attempt to cling on to a familiarity that most of us are kind of scared of losing, but the impermanence of everything eventually sinks in, and I think the Cats simultaneously come across as literal and metaphorical. And paired with some of the best production on the album, I think it leads to an excellent song. And outside of that, yeah, I mean, it's another Mitski album, but I wouldn't say it's one of her strongest, and a lot of the melodies aren't particularly striking. The production could often use a bit more of a spark, and I just don't think it's her strongest writing either, outside of a couple moments. And on top of all that, there's a couple moments that just felt really awkward to me. The car horn in the opening track fooled me every time I listened to this, where for a second I thought there was actually a car horn outside. But more significantly, I find the counting kind of cringy in Rules, and why does Sharon's oboe sound like a mid-2010s indie crossover with those group woo vocals? I think we should have left this sound in 2016. And also, is this just me, or are the melodies on Where's My Phone kind of obnoxious? I can't even fully place why. It just feels awkward and overly playful in a way that doesn't fit the vibe. And that's ignoring the censorship of the word fuck, even though she says it 3 songs later. And then there's Instead of Here, which seems to be a song from the perspective of someone about to commit suicide, if I'm reading it correctly. And look, if you read my blog back in the day, you might remember me being very sensitive to lyrics about suicide, and while I obviously think suicide is bad and it's important to try and prevent it, I do have some potentially controversial opinions on it in the ways that people talk about and write about suicide a lot of the time. And while I'm not as sensitive about it now as I was a few years ago, when I would harshly criticize lyrics that maybe weren't as problematic as I thought they were, I haven't completely changed in that regard, and thus this song doesn't really sit well with me, where the tone just does not match the content at all, and it's the kind of glamour that a song like this really doesn't need. Although I will admit the piano was nice. Back toward positivity, though, I do appreciate the desire to get out of the small town and start a new chapter in one's life on the opening track In a Lake. As someone who grew up in a small town myself and left a year and a half ago, how the fuck has it been that long? That's crazy. And I also will not deny the guitar distortion of If I Leave brought some real crunch that this album needed. So yeah, I think the album's decent, it definitely has some things going for it, and Mitski is still a very good singer when she needs to be, and there are 2 legitimately excellent songs on this album. But beyond that, it's not really all that memorable or special, and she's definitely done better. So I'll give this a 6 out of 10, and it might be a good introduction if you're not familiar with any of her music. But as someone who's not the biggest Mitski fan in general, even I sort of thought this might be better. In 2022, Beihold released her debut EP, Egg in the Back Seat, which was a very quirky album that showed absolutely no fear in being unique, and didn't feel like she was trying to fit in with other pop stars, despite containing her breakout hit song. And honestly, she's barely had any chart success since then, but I actually really liked that EP, and I revisited it recently, and it still holds up for me. Although it's a weird project that feels like it comes with some asterisks. Because while I think the EP is really good, and the title track is excellent, it's very much full of an attitude that is mostly justified, but can come across as obnoxiously self-aware, and pandering to an audience that I don't even know if I could assemble if you asked me to describe said audience completely hypothetically, where her greatest strengths are her greatest weaknesses in terms of songwriting and presentation. In other words, put more simply, as much as I like that EP, I totally understand how some people might find it absolutely insufferable and obnoxious in the worst ways. Maybe a little bit in the vein of AJR with its attempted relatability and quirkiness. I personally think it's better than AJR, and I've never even hated AJR as much as a lot of critics do, but that comparison should ring some alarm bells, especially in terms of expectations for a follow-up full-length album. But hey, that was 4 years ago, and especially considering I like that EP, I kind of felt like maybe she'd take the aspects of that EP that worked for me and maybe turn them into an album that would be a big shift away from what she did then. And I will say that in a lot of ways this feels like a shift, but unfortunately one for the worse, and it's a bad sign that the parallel that I'm drawing is to Marina's album from last year, Princess of Power, where it almost just feels like an artist going, hey, I guess I've got to release an album. My last project was pretty good, so I guess whatever I make now will be good too. Now, I don't actually think that's what happened, but that's the feeling I get from both albums. Now, this album is not nearly as disappointing as that album was, because my expectations weren't nearly as high. But just in terms of the quality, I don't think it's much better, and it honestly makes me kind of glad that the mainstream gave up on Beihold years ago. So where do I begin with this one? Well, I could start with a production that often tries to make this more dramatic than the songwriting really backs up, especially on songs like Scared of the Dark, Brutus, Lottery, and Strong Medicine. Is it wrong for me to say that I'm reminded a little bit of Imagine Dragons? And no, I'm not talking about early Imagine Dragons when they were good. And the thing that actually made me realize the similarities to that Marina album was that Unicorn really just sounds like a mediocre Marina song, where the energy and flashiness seems to be trying to cover up the fact that the song itself is so basic, and the production can't even bring the sort of flashiness that it's aiming for. And speaking of the songwriting, mainly the lyrics, I get the feeling that Beihold thinks this is way more interesting than it actually is, especially when she starts dropping some lines like, "But you're Caesar and I'm Brutus, minus that part with the knife." Or even more cringy is on Soup. "No frou-frou, nothing there to chew-chew, you're not worth the stew-stew, you're no better than soup." And look, there are other cringy lines throughout a lot of this record, but Soup isn't even the worst song on the album. That would be Shiny New Things, which seems to possibly be about a relationship of some sort, but I also feel like there's potentially some shots at Donald Trump, and I agree he's a horrible person and a horrible president, which seems to be the angle she's approaching this from as well, if it is about him. But in her critique of materialism and the way that gets in the way of basic human morals, the whole point is that everybody wants shiny new things without going any deeper, and seems to almost be shrugging it off as normal because I guess that's just everyone's motive. I mean, look, I don't want to come across like I'm saying this song is seriously harmful or anything like that, I think it's pretty clear what it's trying to do, and some might argue it works because she is making a criticism and also acknowledges that she won't let those motivations control her, but it just doesn't work in my opinion, and I feel this way regardless of whether this is specifically about Donald Trump or not. The lack of lyrical focus or detailed punches in this song just feels depressing to listen to, and it's made so much worse by such an obnoxious chorus, bad production that makes this sound like an early Lana Del Rey song, and the la 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 la's that just make me dislike this even more. There are some things I can praise about this album, but even the songs I like feel like they're held back significantly by their flaws, like how Van Gogh has about the most familiar melody you could think of. I don't know all the technical compositional terms for it, but if you hear it, you'll know what I mean. And I also think Hot Goblin is quite good from a lyrical perspective, where she acknowledges her flaws as well as her good qualities, and adopts a mindset that she at least knows who she is, so she doesn't really care that much that she's flawed. I guess that might be a reason I could praise this more than I am, despite the fact that it sounds like another mediocre Marina song sonically, but no, I'm sorry, it just doesn't click. And that's the case with the album overall, which really just tests my patience and arguably gets worse with every listen. 5 out of 10, I don't even think it's awful as much as it is disappointing and lacking in anything to really make it stand out, even in terms of individual songs, except for some of the really bad songs. Nothing here reaches the level of the average song on her 2022 EP, but whatever, it's just not for me. I can't say I'll recommend it, but I also do recognize there's probably an audience for this, so I guess let me know what you think. As hard as it is for me to believe, I don't think I'd ever listened to a full Bruno Mars solo album until recently, when in preparation for this review I decided to listen to all of Bruno Mars' other solo albums, all of which came out in the 2010s, and this is his first in almost a decade, although he did put out that Silk Sonic album with Anderson .Paak in 2021. And I'll be honest, I think I may have been better off not hearing Bruno's albums, because while his second and third albums were better than his painfully bad debut, all three of them suffered from the same dickish energy in the lyrics, with the way he sang about the women in his songs really grossing me out, often playing the role of the nice, respectful guy in ways that just make him sound like a total asshole, beyond just not being a good pop star in terms of the songwriting and performances. But I also decided to listen to An Evening with Silk Sonic again. I had listened to it when it came out, and I hadn't listened to it in forever, and I wanted to see how well it's aged, as someone who liked it at the time but never really loved it. And I still feel the same, unfortunately. I like it better than any Bruno Mars solo album, and there's a very small handful of great songs on it, but as a whole, I stand by the fact that it's a pretty good album, but not a great one. And here on this album, he's once again continuing with that throwback sound, which he's been doing arguably since the early 2010s, and after listening to this multiple times, I'm starting to wonder why I even expected anything more than mediocrity. Maybe it was because he's been showing very small improvements in his albums for the most part, so I guess I thought maybe this would show him taking another step toward greatness. But yeah, unfortunately it's a pretty mediocre album that doesn't give me much to say at all, and even the highlights are not among his best. The production is mostly solid, but I don't think the songwriting really makes me care all that much. And even looking at the production alone, I sometimes wish certain elements were a bit less awkward in the mix, like some of the percussion paired with the horns on Cha Cha Cha, or the crispy snare of Why You Wanna Fight. That isn't a huge issue, but it still hits a bit of an odd timbre for this vibe. Oh, and there's also that weird squeaky sound of Something Serious that really kills the groove. Really a shame, because otherwise that song might have been pretty good. Overall, though, the production on this album is at least passable. But I just find the songwriting bland and uninteresting. The lyrics are often sickly sweet in a way that could work for a different vibe, but it just feels like this album can't figure out if it's sincere or silly and cheesy, or the two vibes awkwardly contrast each other a lot of the time. I mean, at least the dickish energy is mostly gone, but I still find this way too cheesy in ways that are not charming. Oh, and emphasis on mostly regarding the dickish energy, because this album does have Why You Wanna Fight, where he admits to fucking up and just begs and begs someone to come back, trying to be self-aware, but just being overly pushy and clingy, and that song absolutely sucks, especially because it isn't even good sonically, and it all comes together to make me dislike it a lot. Nothing Left has probably the best vocal performance on the album. I'll give Cha 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 credit for having a pretty good hook and some nice instrumental melodies, and God Was Showing Off is one of those kind of over-the-top love songs that I think mostly works and is quite charming, especially with such lively production and instrumentation. Probably the best song on the album, but I still would not quite call it great. But I haven't even mentioned yet that through the majority of this album, and honestly Bruno Mars' music in general, I don't really like his singing style, where it sounds like he's trying way too hard to be impressive rather than really making effective songs. And considering how little there is here that's worth going back to, 5 out of 10, and I shouldn't even be disappointed. I'm really just not much of a Bruno Mars fan in general, even if I'll admit some of his collabs are really strong, like Uptown Funk, or some of the songs from that Silk Sonic album, and he's a big part of the reason those songs are so good. But on his own albums, yeah, I don't have much to say that's positive. So here's a shoegaze band you may have heard of, who's been around since the 2010s, and this is their first album in nearly 5.5 years, excluding the collaborative album they made with Full of Hell in 2023, which I reviewed back on my blog back in the day. And I'm a big fan of that album, but I haven't listened to one of Nothing's projects by themselves until now. And one thing I can say for sure is this is a gloomy listen, with lyrics that are pretty consistently devastating amidst the attempts to cling on to hope, and the melancholic feelings are made even more strong by the ways the guitars just wash over you, and the subtle eeriness of the production, and the way the instruments all work together to create such a dull mood, which seems very intentional. And while I don't always love how the mixing sometimes buries the vocals, I do think it kind of makes sense for this kind of album that's so gloomy, where the narrator is haunted by so many things. I still wish the mixing sounded a bit better, but I don't mind it as much as I otherwise would for this reason. It's also not an issue throughout the entire album, the title track being the worst offender. And there's a lot I can praise about certain moments on this album. I really like the mix of experimentation and straightforward shoegaze in Toothless Coal, the bleakly beautiful use of the instrumental palette in The Rain Don't Care, the gorgeous melodies of Ballet, the Traitor, the tension throughout Purple Strings, with the strings adding I didn't even realize the strings adding such great terror behind the gentle acoustic guitar, as well as the great punchy snare in the closing track. Sorry, I got caught off guard because I realized I was talking about the strings in a song called Purple Strings. But also lyrically, I think this album is mostly effective in what it's trying to do. Whether we're talking about Purple Strings, where the narrator seems to be moving in a positive direction, but the asterisks to that are arguably more haunting as a result, the pure bleakness of Cannibal World with the horror of reality sinking in for the narrator, including the ways we sometimes need to make enemies even when we don't want to. And then there's the closing track, which on the surface seems to be about losing a loved one and the haunting memories that come with that. But lines like, "You're my favorite fear," leave it more open to interpretation, and it kind of sums up the album perfectly, where there's this haunting feeling of dread throughout, even though it's trying to provide comfort and peace for the listener and or the narrator. I guess sometimes embracing your fears and trying to find a silver lining is the best thing we can do in certain situations. And it's funny, I actually thought early in this album that it reminded me in some odd ways of Radiohead in certain moments, even though that comparison is not accurate at all to describe the overall album. Just certain moments that almost feel a little bit reminiscent of early Radiohead. And then later on, they seem to interpolate Fake Plastic Trees on Nerve Scales, which may or may not have been intentional, but it's very noticeable to me as someone who's been listening to the Bends a lot this year. I also do have a tendency to make Radiohead comparisons more often than I probably should, just keep that in mind as I say all this. As a whole, this seems to be an album representing someone living in a chaotic world, which we all are, and not having the answers they want to have, despite recognizing themselves as part of the whole, and where every attempt to find comfort just has some sort of dark cloud. I could be totally wrong about these interpretations, but paired with such beautiful instrumentation that usually captures the right feelings considering the content, I'll give this an 8 out of 10 for doing a lot of things quite well, even if I'm not sure it's exceptional, nor do I really know whether or not this will have a ton of replay value for me. It is a great project that's worth checking out though, so if you're a fan of shoegaze, you're probably going to want to hear this. So here's a new debut album from this band I'd never heard of before, and I saw it getting a decent amount of acclaim, although not a huge amount. I'm pretty sure I saw it described somewhere as post-punk, and I love post-punk at its best, so I thought this would be worth a shot. And if you can get past some rough edges in the production and the occasional groove that feels a little stale or unpolished, I actually think this has a lot going for it. I really like a lot of the grimy guitars, the drums have some nice punch to them, the accordion really adds a lot of texture that makes this stand out a bit more, and the songwriting is quite interesting too, especially in the ways they make these stories fit with the mood of the songs. And the lyrics are quite well written too, with lead vocalist Ewan Manning singing about growing up in a violent environment, relationship problems, and a lot of ambiguity for what he's actually singing about on a lot of these tracks. He has mentioned, though, that it takes influence from his life, but isn't specifically about him. But it's written in a way where it feels both personal and artistic in a way that leaves me arguably more intrigued than anything, and it's part of the album's charm, especially when the vocal delivery brings so much more to the table about the potential feelings and emotions conveyed. I guess if there's a big asterisk to this album, it's mainly that it takes a while to really get going, and most of the best songs are toward the end. If you stop halfway through, you'll think it's a pretty solid indie rock album, and that's it. Before the last 4 songs push this album to greatness, which is why I'm giving this album a light 8 out of 10, and I would absolutely recommend listening to it all the way through, but it is still falling a bit short of what I think it could be due to some songs dragging on longer than they need to, and certain passages just feeling a bit unnecessary, and it doesn't feel like it's doing anything particularly revolutionary as a whole, but even most great albums don't, and I did enjoy this quite a bit. I just wouldn't set your expectations too high, that's all. So I was gonna try and do the full discography deep dive for Gorillaz in preparation for this review, but considering how many other reviews I've been trying to do, and the fact that there's a few other discographies I'm going through to prepare for upcoming reviews, I kinda stopped after checking out a few of Gorillaz' early albums, which based on the 1 or 2 listens I gave those albums just didn't really do much for me. And from what I've heard, apparently they get way worse after Plastic Beach. And even Demon Days, which I'm pretty sure is usually considered their best, I mostly liked, but more due to the features than Damon Albarn himself, and I just got the vibe Gorillaz' music probably just isn't for me. I do remember reviewing their 2023 album on my blog when it came out, and I didn't like it very much. I admittedly haven't listened to that album in about 3 years, but I just decided to go straight into this new album, which is largely about death. Both Damon Albarn and Jamie Hewlett lost their fathers between their previous album and this one, and there's a lot of vocal samples from previous Gorillaz collaborators who have since passed away. There's also some commentary on the current state of the world, in addition to the memories of old friends who aren't here anymore. The album was also largely inspired by Albarn and Hewlett's trip to India, which is very apparent in the music that draws influence from Indian classical instrumentation. It's quite different from the stuff you'll hear on their self-titled or Demon Days. And let me just be clear, I don't know much about the Gorillaz lore, or the fictional characters in the virtual band, or anything like that. And look, I'm also not sure how prevalent all that lore is on this album or other Gorillaz albums, so I may be missing a lot that relates to it, or maybe I'm not missing anything in that regard. I'm not really sure. I wonder if they're comparable to other bands like 21 Pilots or Sleep Token in the way the lore relates to their music. I'm honestly not sure. But anyway, in discussing this new album, The Mountain, I guess I'll just stop dancing around what I really want to say, which is that I ended up liking this way more than I thought I would. And I guess the best place for me to start is the production, which gives the bass line such strong presence as foundations for these really solid grooves, where the percussion sounds great in the mix, and all the instruments come together to create such pretty textures, where it's easy to get lost in either the grooves or just the pure beauty of these soundscapes. And I feel like I'm put in a bit of a weird place when trying to discuss the lyrics on this project, because like I said, there are definitely themes of death here, as well as some more general social commentary, and yet it's done in a way that oddly seems to emphasize the sound of the album and just letting the listener feel the music. Or maybe that's not the case at all, and it's just the way I experienced it. But look, while I can respect and appreciate a lot of the lyrics here, like how The Empty Dream Machine feels like it portrays the world as, well, the song's title, where dreams start to feel more and more distant, and Black Thought talks about how racism makes this even worse, and how the happy dictator satirically celebrates an authoritarian leader who is disguising themselves as looking out for everyone, and unfortunately there's far too many of those in the world. And I also like a lot of the overall themes of the album, both as a whole and in terms of individual moments. Well, I still feel like I'm more drawn to the beautiful instrumentation and production, like the instrumental on The God of Lying that reminds me of Dirty Harry from Demon Days, the bouncy groove of The Moon Cave, and the ethereal atmosphere and sitar on The Empty Dream Machine. And there are some really strong features here, too. Not just the posthumous ones, but also from living artists like Kara Jackson, multiple great guest verses from Black Thought, Sparks, and even Idols, as well as others. I do think the whistling on Orange County was pretty obnoxious, and toward the end of the album, you could argue it starts to overstay its welcome, especially with a song like The Sweet Prince, which I would call a dud. But overall, for what this album is, I think it actually works way better than I expected, at least for my personal taste. And I think even if I look past the surprise element, I'm still very happy with how this turned out. And I'll give it a light 8 out of 10. Again, I'm shocked I'm rating it that high, but I cannot deny how much I ended up liking this. And maybe you will too. Alright, thank you so much for watching. As always, it's just my personal opinions on these albums. yeah, like I said, I will be slowing down with the reviews a little bit. I do have some other videos I'm planning on making, but these mini review videos, they will not be as, well, they'll probably be about as frequent, but they'll probably be less albums than usual. I mean, I'm only doing 7 in this one. I've been doing quite a few recently that have 10 albums, and this one I only did 7. I'll probably do, yeah, more videos like this where there's maybe 6 reviews or 7 reviews or 8 reviews or something like that. I'm trying not to make a 6-7 joke here. 6-7. Anyway, thank you for watching. I will see you all later.